My name is Alex Rack, and I'm excited to share with you some information on the sixth cantata of Johann Sebastian Bach's Christmas Oratorio. I will be discussing the first half of this cantata, and my colleague Joanne Weischek will continue with the second half of the series. The sixth cantata of the Christmas Oratorio is a jubilant celebration of the Feast of the Epiphany and the continuation of the story of the wise men, with the narrative coming from Matthew chapter 2, verses 7 through 12. The main focus of this cantata is the plotting of the enemies of the faithful and the protection God gives us from those enemies. The embodiment of those enemies in the story is King Herod, as he sends the three wise men to visit the newly born Jesus. Another recurring theme is the consoling presence of Christ in the believer's heart. This cantata was the last to be written and borrowed heavily from another sacred cantata which has been lost. We now refer to the source as BWV 248A, which was written within a year of the Christmas Oratorio. Bach parodied more movements in the 6 parts than in the first 5, and went so far as to leave all of the parodied movements in the same keys as the original material. Usually he would transpose them into a new key. This suggests that Bach may have been running out of time and rushing to finish the final part of this cantata as the Advent season approached in 1734. The first movement begins with a long instrumental ritornello, or prelude, orchestrated with trumpets and timpani. The use of trumpets and timpani is remarkable, as only 2 other Christmas oratorio cantatas use this triumphant orchestration, and this ritornello has a particularly virtuosic trumpet line. Unlike most of the other opening movements of the Christmas Oratorio, movement 45, or the first movement of this cantata, starts in the middle of the narrative, or in medias res. The music juxtaposes the faithful maintaining their steadfast devotion and arrogant enemies armed with sharp claws. The first words sung by the choir are, "Lord, when our proud enemies snarl," which is set in an active fugue. The tenors enter first with a series of ascending leaps, leading into a long melisma, or string of notes all sung in the same syllable. The altos, sopranos, and tenors follow suit, with nearly the same musical material, creating a level of discord which reflects the defensive and combative text. The first time the choir sings all together as one, or homophonically, is when they sing the words, "And from the clutches of the foes we escape." Right from the beginning, Bach shows us the central idea of this 6th cantata of the Christmas Oratorio: God is our protector from those who wish to do us harm. Now let's listen to that ritornello with that virtuosic trumpet line. Very celebratory, festive feast music, and then you can even hear that small tinge of that enemies underneath the surface. Now let's skip ahead to hear that fugue and when the choir comes together to sing as one. Tenors begin, followed by the altos. Moving on to the second movement. It is a secco recitative with the text from the 2nd chapter of Matthew, verses 7 and 8. It begins with the evangelist and includes an appearance from Herod, who sings in the bass register. While the text itself does not indicate Herod's treachery, it is revealed to us right at the beginning of the recit through Bach's setting and music. In measure 2, the evangelist sings a large ascending leap of a seventh on the word secretly, or Heimlich in German, referring to the meeting of the wise men with Herod prior to their departure. This large leap shows the deception before Herod even has a chance to speak.
Aber rief Herodes die Weisen heimlich und
When Herod does enter, his melody also speaks louder than his words. On the final word, worship, or anbete, Herod sings a flourish, which, as we have seen from other works of Bach, usually is used to show devotion. Here, Bach puts this flourish on the last syllable, or the weak beat, undermining its usual meaning.
Dass ich auch komme und es anbete.
The third movement continues with this theme of deceit and a recitativo accompagnado for soprano. We hear a reflection of Herod's somewhat innocuous recit from the last movement and the soprano's opening line, "Liar, you seek only to destroy the Lord." Bach sets this in the first two words with a large ascending leap on the du Falsche, and a dissonant chord, immediately creating this sense of unease. This deceit and drama is balanced by comfort via the two cadences. On remains in secure hands, and whom you seek to crush. The minor modality and dissonant vocal line give way to a major cadence and a grace note sung by the soprano, which gives this sense of rest and ease. This movement is somewhat exceptional in that it's one of the few recitatives that Bach had parodied from another work. This is uncommon. Usually arias and chorales may be parodied, but a recitative is so closely related to the text itself that they're usually rewritten. While the vocal line has been changed to accommodate the changed text, the harmony and bass line remain exactly the same from BWV 248A.
Dein Herz, dein falsches Herz ist schon, nimmst aller seiner List, des höchsten Sohn, den du zu stürzen suchst, sehr wohl bekannt.
The fourth movement is the first aria of this sixth cantata and is sung by the soprano. Some interesting aspects of this aria include its tempo marking, largo e staccato, or slow and separated, and the extensive instrumental ritornelli in the beginning, middle, and end of the aria. Both these characteristics we have seen in a secular cantata from Bach's time working for the curtain court. According to scholar Marcus Rathi, this secular cantata may be the source of the material for this movement rather than BWV 248A, which we've seen in the other movements. The aria also calls for obbligato, or required, oboe d'amore, which is an instrument often considered the alto of the oboe family, and was mentioned by my colleague Corey in an earlier presentation. This gives the aria a specific and somewhat mellow tone, and this tone and slow tempo are fitting for the emotional content of this aria, which contrasts the fiery recitativo accompagnado, which preceded it. The first two lines of the text are, "Only a wave of his hand topples the impotent power of humans." For the first time since the opening movement, the second theme of this cantata is presented, or the theme of God's hands as refuge and protection from our enemies. In a major mode and a dance meter, this movement has a wonderfully uplifting effect. This aria is also based on a dance called a polonaise, or a Polish dance in a slow triple meter. Bach's audience in 1734 would have recognized this dance style, and it would have had a political significance. The War of Polish Succession was still going on in 1734, and to Bach's audience, the insolent enemy mentioned in this aria would have been more than a metaphor. but a reference to their contemporary foes. From Matthew chapter 2, this time verses 9 through 11. Here the evangelist describes the wise men leaving the court of Herod and arriving at the manger with their gifts. This is the first movement of the sixth cantata that does not focus on the efforts of the believers' enemies. Instead, the narrative of the wise men continues, as they are given heavenly guidance in the form of a star. One thing to listen for is how Bach uses pitch to set the scene of the star over the child in the manger. On the words, und stüd oben über, or came and stood over, the evangelist sings a high arcing melody to paint the stage of the manger in music.
Als sie nun den König gehört hatten, zogen sie hin, siehe, der Stern, den sie im Morgenlande gesehen hatten, ging für ihnen hin, bis dass kam, und stund oben über, da das Kindlein war.
It happens kind of fast, but it's an important moment. The sixth moment is the first chorale movement of the final cantata in the Christmas Oratorio, and like the movement prior, it does not focus on enemies. Instead, this chorale meditates on the gifts the wise men have brought and relates that to how the congregation of the time could be as generous as their God. The first two verses of the chorale share the same musical material and speak from the perspective of the wise men. I stand here by your cradle, O little Jesus, my life. I come and I bring and give to you what you have given to me. When the music changes in the third verse, it's strophic, so the first two verses have the same musical material. So does the perspective. No longer is the speaker referring to earthly gifts, but how the believer gives everything to God. Take it. It is my spirit and my mind, my heart, my soul, and will. Take all of it, and let it be pleasing to you. Let's begin with the second verse. Another change of perspective. Easily one of my favorite movements of this work. And now I'll hand it off to my colleague Joanne, who will present the second half of this sixth movement.
Hello, I'm Joanne Weischek, and I will be discussing the last 5 movements of the sixth cantata. As mentioned in earlier presentations, much of the Christmas Oratorio is borrowed or parodied from previously used material. The second half of the sixth cantata opens with 3 movements for tenor. There is speculation that the 8th and the 9th movements were formerly used material. These are all sung by the tenor, which is unusual and something I will address later. Additionally, the recitative for 4 voices that follows the 3 movements for tenor was definitely parodied material. Bach usually composed new recitatives because of how specific and important the text and music relationship is. With that said, it's just easier to start fresh. The fact that this is parody suggests that Bach was under a deadline and running out of time. The first secco, or dry recitative of the Evangelist, returns us to the narrative of King Herod, who characterizes the struggle against Christ. The Evangelist quotes Matthew 2:12, in which God warns the wise men in a dream not to return to Herod. The wise men return home another way. To create the illusion of the dream, Bach chooses a key for this recitative that is vastly different from the chorale that we've just left. In the second measure, a diminished chord is heard around the word Traum, which means dream. Such a crunchy and uncomfortable chord is symbolic of the haziness often associated with a dreamlike ideal. Note that this recitative flows immediately into the next movement, attacca, or without pause.
Und Gott befahl ihnen im Traum, dass sie sich nicht sollten wieder zu Herodes hängen, und zogen durch einen andern Weg wieder in ihr Land.
Bach is careful to set the following accompagnato recitative to show that although the wise men and shepherds leave Jesus, Jesus, or the treasure, never leaves us. The accompagnato recitative contrasts the gospel text of the previous secco recitative sung by the Evangelist with the sustained accompaniment symbolizing Christ's love and eternal presence. Although both the secco and accompagnato recitatives are sung by the tenor, it is important to note that the latter has a change in character noted by the use of personal pronouns. It is most unusual to see the tenor voice continue with the narrative, as traditionally this would have been assigned to the alto. That is indicated by the text, which suggests a feminine dialogue appropriate for the time. This suggests a last-minute adjustment by Bach, or possibly due to the deadline constraints mentioned earlier. The text is highly emotional, as it expresses the confession of love and trust for Jesus, while also holding contempt for the enemy. Furthermore, this is ultimately a reflection of the bride's love, or the church's love, for the bridegroom, who is Christ. Since this text would have been written for alto, it is unusual to see it given to tenor. The oboes d'amore return as the only instruments other than the continuo. As mentioned earlier, this instrument of love has a warm and low sound. It is much less bright and present than the traditional oboe. As a result, the oboes d'amore duet has a very expressive and intimate quality. This appropriately mirrors the text of the accompagnato recitative being about the love between Christ and the church. This choice of instrumentation, along with the accompagnato recitative, refers back to the first recitative in part 1, which was written for alto. Both have instrumental asides between the vocalist text. However, in part 6, the singer is emotionally conflicted. He desires to show his love for Christ while simultaneously feeling contempt for the enemies of Christ. This is emphasized through the modal shifts between major and minor, as well as tempo changes between slow vocal lines and fast instrumental interludes. The movement ultimately ends in a minor or dark key on the text, "Lord, help, help me."
So geht genug, mein Schatz geht nicht von hier. Bleibet da bei mir, ich will ihn auch nicht von mir lassen. Sein Arm wird mich aus Lieb mit Sanftmut voll
next aria, a warning to foes. In the aria, the oboes d'amore are still present. The tempo or speed of this movement is vivace, lively, with very active instrumental parts that are directly reflected in the opening of the vocal line. The second half of the instrumental introduction uses repeated notes that press into the downbeat and then resolve by ascending upwards. This press and relieve is like a sigh and returns on words like treasure or joy and refuge or life. The melodic setting of the text uses very little embellishment, but it ends with the repetition of the last line 4 times. The meanings of treasure and refuge are emphasized through large leaps. Though the repetition grows with confidence and a declamatory nature each time, the vocal line is left with a feeling that something is unfinished as it wavers on a held note. The speed slows dramatically on the text, "My Savior dwelleth here," and then returns to the original speed with an instrumental closing.
Möge stolzen Weine stecken, was kennt mir für Furcht erwecken. Mein Schatz, mein Hort ist hier bei mir, mein Schatz, mein Hort ist hier bei mir. Mein Schatz, mein Hort ist hier bei mir, mein Schatz, mein Hort. Ist hier bei mir.
The recitative that follows utilizes all 4 solo voices, soprano, alto, tenor, and bass. This type of recitative is uncommon in Bach's sacred music, making its only other appearance in Bach's works in the St. Matthew Passion. The 4-voice recitative is, however, quite common in Bach's secular works. This assumes that perhaps this movement is also parodied. The setting of each of these voices appear as they would throughout the oratorio. Soprano, tenor, and bass propose questions, while it is the alto who arrives with the statement, "We rest in Jesus' hands," which prepares us for the fanfare celebration of the final movement. The final chorale begins as the cantata begins, with fanfare trumpets and resounding timpani. The vocal lines are often interrupted with jubilant, virtuosic instrumental lines. It is a celebration of Christ's birth, but also the defeat of the enemy. The melody is borrowed from the traditional Herzlich tut mich verlangen, and the text is part of a Christmas hymn by George Werner. The melody is the same hymn melody used in the very first chorale of our opening cantata. This commonality brings us full circle with the use of what would have been recognized by Bach's congregation as the Passion Chorale. This is deeply symbolic because although we are celebrating the birth of Christ, we are simultaneously looking at the ultimate sacrifice in his death and the gift that he gives us by bearing the weight of sin in our place. Before the moment, we commemorate the safe arrival of a baby boy. Let's listen to the final chorale and reflect on the journey we've made through these last 3 cantatas. This is incredibly joyous and triumphant music. I especially love the virtuosic trumpet part because the instruments they would have performed on in Bach's time would have been more primitive, making these complex lines as well as incredible range all the more impressive. The chorale text opens with, "Now you are well avenged upon your hostile host, for Christ has fully broken all that you opposed." Scholar Marcus Rathey notes, the hope for the coming bridegroom, or Christ, is expressed in part 1 of the oratorio, and it has now come full circle as Jesus will remain the beloved bridegroom in eternity. Thank you for listening to all of our presentations. I hope that you have enjoyed this. Let's close by listening to the entirety of the final chorale.